everyone, I'm Katie.
And I'm Vic.
And we watch so many movies for you guys. So as you guys probably guessed, today we are talking about movies. But since this is a book channel, they are all movies that pertain to books.
Yes, what we did was we watched movies based on books. So we either read the books or watched the movies or both. And today we're going to look at whether they are the same story.
Yeah, that was kind of our main question as we were going into this was, are they the same? We've all watched those movies after being in love with the books and feeling a difference in them.
Yes, that they just are different in some undefinable way or definable way, as we can point out now.
Yeah,
that just makes it not the same story at all.
Right. That was our first question as we were watching these movies. Why are they so different? Mm-hmm. And I think one of the biggest things is budget restraints.
Yes, budget can make a huge difference in whether the movie can really hit all the kind of fantastical elements that the story in the book is able to hit, because it's just words on a page. It doesn't require editing and CGI and all the fancy things that go into movies.
Right. And I think one of the big examples of that was Jurassic Park, the book by Michael Crichton, where there is a scene right at the beginning of the movie where they're going on a tour and everyone's in the Jeeps and they're passing each paddock and they're not seeing any dinosaurs, and there's a sense of disappointment. It's just empty, like nothing is happening. Mm-hmm. But in the books, at that part, they are seeing the dinosaurs that are in those paddocks. They're interacting with them, and it's a very awe-inspiring moment. And I think one of the reasons that didn't happen in the movie was just budget restraint. You know, at the time, you had to design all of those dinosaurs, and then CGI was not a cheap thing to use then, and it wasn't as refined as it is now. So I really think that was one of the decisions made, at least in that part, what was to just eliminate that altogether. I also think it was to build up suspense for when the T-Rex is revealed. Yeah. I guess we should have mentioned there are going to be some spoilers in this episode.
Definitely going to be spoilers for all of these movies, so we will mention what movie we're talking about beforehand before getting into any spoilers for their story.
Yes, yeah.
But I think for Jurassic Park, the thing that we have to remember is that it was a groundbreaking movie. It did have a huge budget, but even with that budget in that time, they did so many amazing things, but they could only go so far. They only had so much money. So we see a lot of really cool animatronics with the T-Rex and CGI with all the other dinosaurs, and that's very groundbreaking, very relevant still, very good still, but it's still not up to the task of really getting all of those dinosaurs they needed, especially compared to the newer movies, which have a little more availability of those things. We see more.
You can see dinosaurs all over the place in the new movies because our CGI is so refined that the ability is just there for them to do. And I actually think in the later movies, for the older ones too, you see more dinosaur engagement, because it was a new thing when the first movie came out, and then eventually they were able to build upon that, I think.
Yes, and they were making entirely new technologies to help make these dinosaurs, so it really had to do a lot of that groundwork before they could get into it. So that explains a lot of the things that changed. A lot of the big moments in the book had to be taken out because they just didn't have the money for it.
The other big one I think we see in those types of movies is time restriction as well. A book can be as long as it needs to be. You can have a 600-page book with descriptions of everything you're seeing, but that 600 pages might translate to 4 hours of movie.
Yes, and that is why another movie that we watched was Coraline, which, because it's based off of a much shorter book, because of the way it was shot, because of the difference in that story from Jurassic Park, I do think they were able to get a lot of the actual story points in that maybe Jurassic Park wasn't able to do, because it doesn't require that huge budget for CGI, even though it is stop motion, so it is a lot of work. It's very beautiful stop motion. But because it's a shorter story, there are some illustrations in it originally. It's for juvenile fiction. Because of that, I think beyond anything else, they just had more time to work with for each story point. So they didn't have to cut things out because there wasn't enough time.
Well, that is to say, though, that it's not precisely true to the book. We actually discovered when watching Coraline that they added, Vic, I think this is what you mentioned because you had read the book, that they added a completely new character to the story.
Yes, Coraline had a friend in the movie, and he was just another kid her age who we're introduced to. And I'm sitting there watching the movie, and I think, I don't know who this character is. So we had to look it up, and he is not in the book. I was remembering correctly, and the reasoning behind that, according to some articles online, is that she does spend a lot of time alone. She does spend a lot of time talking to herself, and they needed something else to be there, something to put into those scenes to not have just this girl wandering alone. And so that is another reasoning behind some changes, is that books can narrate, they can have a lot of internal thoughts, they can have the characters just go off on their own and do whatever they want, and movies kind of struggle with that. We see very famous movies that have just one person, and the acting that goes into that is so difficult. So having just this movie, this animated movie for kids with this girl going off on her own, would have been pretty difficult. So that's why they put someone else in to kind of engage with her.
Which is actually one of our next points that we were talking about, which is the visual restrictions that come from translating a book to a movie. So what Vic was mentioning was that, you know, they had to add that character to it to make it more entertaining for the audience to watch, for them not to feel isolated from the main character. I think we see a lot of movies that add in a little bit, or I think Ready Player One, which is another one that we watched, was one where like the first challenge in the book was a simple arcade game that they had to be, you know, like Pac-Man. I actually haven't read the books. Vic read the book.
Well, I think the biggest changes in the challenges is really the cut out of the scenes where you have to act out every single part of the scene to get to the next
from
part.
different movies that it references, right?
And that, of course, is partly trademark and partly not. Being able to copyright on those movies, like they can't use just a whole scene from a movie very easily. So they made it more engaging by putting in like the race and going backwards and stuff that really actually is interesting to watch, instead of just rewatching a movie you might have seen or might not have seen.
Right.
And so that allows the story to progress without the reader or the viewer just getting stuck in this point for a little while and not really have anything going on in the actual world. They kind of made up for that with the, again, spoilers for this, with the Shining moment in it. They went into a movie and they experienced some aspects of that movie, and that was how they took that story point, those living images of the movies, and they just moved it a little so that it had the same flavor, but it wasn't the same.
Which, I mean, it was very interesting as someone who hadn't read the book, that like how they did it, but hearing Vic talk about those aspects in the book made me want to read the book after seeing the movie, because I wanted to experience that as the author had written it. So it was very interesting to watch, having not read the book. I think our last point on like why are the two so different from each other, and this is a big one that we see in a lot of book to movies, is the lack of understanding of the source material. I think a lot of times people will read, producers or directors will read the story, or writers, I should say, will read the story, and they pick out the really cool aspects of the story, but the fundamentals of it are lost to them. And one of the ones that, actually there were two that I think we could use as an example for those, was the new Artemis Fowl movie and Aragon, which are both fantastic books, but the core of them from the movies is missing.
They're very different stories. So while the movies might be good and they might be engaging to audiences, someone who has read the book is not going to get the same experience that they did from reading that, because the core of the character or the core of the plot has been changed from the original so much that it's just different.
I think one of the ways we saw that in the books, specifically with Artemis Fowl, and spoilers ahead for this one, Artemis is a very pale, very reserved, very arrogant child. And in the movie, you see him surfing and doing hiking and that sort of thing.
And then fighting at some point.
Which is, in the book is not something that character would ever do. So when that translation happened, again, it could have been for more entertaining watching and that sort of thing, which is something you have to keep in mind when critiquing these movies, that they decided that was going to be more visually entertaining to watch rather than some arrogant kid in a suit who tells his butler to do everything.
And it is that Artemis Fowl specifically is a very hard thing to move over, because at his core, Artemis is a villain to many people. Even in the first book especially, he is one of the villains of the story, even though he's also the protagonist. So it's hard to put out media that has a villain as your main character, even if he does have redemption arcs, even if he does do good things. So I can see why they made the change to a little bit more sporty, a little bit more worldly, just a little bit more caring about the people around him, because that's someone that the viewers are more likely to empathize with.
But that inherently made it a different movie.
It did. When you change the main character that much, you are looking at a different story. So it could be good, it could be bad, it doesn't matter, it just is different.
Which I think brings us to our next question while we were watching it, which was, is it better to read the book before you go and see the movie? Now, as a, I guess a beforehand warning, I actually saw some of these movies before I read the book. So I saw Aragon and Ready Player One, and actually Pride and Prejudice too, which is another movie that we watched as well. I saw those before reading the books. And coincidentally, I love the Aragon movie so much. But I then went and read the book, and you can definitely see the difference in the and how different they are. So for me, I think it depends, because sometimes watching the movie will get me to want to read the book, like it did for Ready Player One, where like I've now seen the movie was really cool and the concept of it was very cool, but now I want to read the book. I want more of that world to read.
And I have not read any of these books after seeing the movie. I definitely saw the movie after reading the book in all cases. I don't necessarily think that gave me the best experience, though. I do think that it's possible that if I had watched the movie first in, for example, the case of Artemis Fowl, and not been comparing them, that would have changed my viewing entirely. I mean, it would have, and it might have made me like it more or less, just depending on how you're viewing that story, because books inherently are able to give you a lot more information. So if you go from all of the stuff that you're getting from the book to a movie that has to condense that has to change things for action, it's much more likely to give you a bad experience than if you see the movie, you see all the cool things that are happening, and then you get to go back and read the book and get all of that background. So it definitely would depend on what kind of person you are, what kind of reader you are, and how you enjoy consuming your media. So there's definitely not a secure answer to this question.
And it depends on if knowing the ending of the story is going to affect whether or not you enjoy the book or not. I know that was that was a big one for me, where a lot of times I would see the movie and I was like, oh, I know how it ends now, which I think in now having watched these movies in comparison to the books, I know that those endings can be different, or not as expansive as the book endings. So like Vic said, it really depends on the type of person you are, and what your personality is when it comes to movies in regards to their books.
Yes.
So Vic, let me ask you this. What would make a good book to movie translation?
So I think the core of a good book to movie translation is getting the characters correct. If you can get the points of who that person is down and you can translate them well to the screen, that really will carry whatever story that you're trying to do. If you have a person who is, so for Sherlock Holmes, that's a very great example. We watched the Robert Downey Jr. movies for this. That movie took Sherlock Holmes as a character, took all of the books that we have of him, and condensed down what they thought the core of his character was. the core of who Watson was, the core of who Irene Adler and Moriarty are. And it really gave us something that took those core aspects and put them into a new story that is not an original one.
Right, it's not based off any of the plot.
Exactly. That's not based off of any of the original Conan Doyle stories. And it took that and made it new, and it worked because it is the same people. So you can see Sherlock Holmes talking with the villain, talking with the secret societies in that, talking with Lestrade, and you can say that's Sherlock Holmes. That is what he would be like. It may not be everyone's iteration of Sherlock Holmes, but it's certainly one that's fairly accurate to the original source material. So that's a successful adaptation, particularly because they got those characters right. So the story also has to be good, but if you can get those characters down, you really just have to build around them. And I think Pride and Prejudice is very similar.
Right, I was gonna say with Pride and Prejudice, they get the characters, but I think the core of Pride and Prejudice is actually the main plot points that happen in that book. So the more successful adaptations that we've seen, we watched the 2005 Pride and Prejudice one, which is my favorite. But there are some really good adaptations of it, and I think where we get those is because they focus on the main plots of that. You're always going to have a Darcy, you're always going to have an Elizabeth Bennet, and they're always going to have those core moments where he says something to offend her, he proposes to her, he messes up somehow and has to redeem himself. There are always those core moments in the movie, and I think that's where a lot of movies lose some of their adaptations, is because they're too much focused on the cool visual aspects of it and not those core plot moments that make the book.
Yes, because if you're trying to follow the actual source material, you're not making a new story with the characters, as in Sherlock Holmes. Like in Pride and Prejudice, you have to take those characters on their journey and make it realistic. So if you take out parts of the plot, if you take out things that are really the core experiences those characters have, so for example, Elizabeth rejecting Darcy is always going to have to be in that movie, because if that's not there, that doesn't let any of the rest of the movie happen.
It takes away the pride.
Exactly. So that is a good point, that if you have a character adaptation and you're just doing the characters, you have to get them right. But if you're trying to do the actual source material, do the actual story, you also have to know what plot points are important and what you can get rid of.
Right. So speaking of Pride and Prejudice and Sherlock Holmes and all that, the next coming episodes for Shelf Indulgence are going to be some pretty special ones that I'm really excited about, because we're going to be talking about the world of fandoms, and Sherlock Holmes being one of the biggest fandoms ever to come out of a book.
Long-lasting fandom.
Long-lasting fandom, to the point they brought a character back.
From the dead.
From the dead. Spoiler?
For some later stories.
Later stories, I guess. And then Pride and Prejudice, which has so many adaptations of itself that, like, it's astounding how it survived that long. So we're going to be talking about fandoms. I'm really excited about it. And then there's going to be a really special episode, but I won't tell what that one's about, because I want you guys to be excited for it. If you guys want to check out any of the books that we mentioned today, or any of the movies, because we have both, you can check us out at clermontlibrary.org. You can also check out some of the other videos that we've done in the previous Shelf Indulgence episodes.
And please comment down below if you want to give us your favorite movie adaptation, talk about what they did well, what they didn't. We really would love to hear from you.
Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm Katie.
And I'm Vic, and this has been Shelf Indulgence.